Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
I used to ask why I was always left out of the family portraits. This year, I didn't bother. I just put up a giant billboard outside their favorite church, my face, my company logo, and the words, "Excluded but never outdone." And let me tell you, Helen Murphy almost fainted at the Sunday service. That's how it started, or rather, how it ended. Or maybe how it began again, depending on how you look at these things. Because if you ask me when the story really started, I'd say somewhere around 3rd grade, the year my mom accidentally forgot to order me a school photo package while managing to order extras for my sister Karen and baby Frank. There I was, watching other kids hand out wallet-sized glossies like candy, while my photo, for some reason, never even made it into the album. At the time, I didn't say much about it. Maybe because I thought I had done something wrong, missed a deadline, lost a form, but that kind of thing kept happening. I got used to being the missing person in a family that always seemed camera ready, as long as I wasn't in the frame. Now, if you ask Helen, my mother, she'd say I was always difficult. Dana always wanted everything to be about her. She once told my aunt during Thanksgiving dinner, loud enough that I heard it from the kitchen. And Karen, her perfect shadow, just nodded with that smug little smile she reserved for the moments when I wasn't quite sure whether to laugh or cry. It's a strange thing, growing up feeling like a guest in your own family. You start developing this permanent sense of apology, like you're always in the way, even when you're doing everything right. I was the kid who got straight A's without being asked. The one who volunteered to help clean up dinner just to hear Dad say, "Thanks, kid." He never did, by the way. He was more the grunt and nod type, a man who lived under the old-school belief that praise should be earned in blood and sweat, not math grades and science fair ribbons. But it wasn't his silence that stung the most. It was the silence that followed after Ma. My name was skipped in the prayer list at church, or when they handed out matching family shirts for the 4th of July barbecue, and mine was lost in the mail. By the time I was 22 and moving into my first apartment, a tiny second-floor unit above a dry cleaner that smelled like starch and regret, I had already accepted that my place in the Murphy family was to orbit, never land. I wasn't invited to Frank Jr.'s surprise ordination party, and that wasn't a fluke. It was planned. My mother had actually told my cousin Erin, "Dana probably wouldn't want to come anyway. She's not really into religion," as if that explained erasing me from one of the most defining events in our family's life. And maybe she was right. I wasn't into religion. I had stopped pretending by then. But it wasn't about faith. It was about the fact that my brother, who used to borrow my CDs and sneak into my room to cry over breakups, never once told me he was becoming a pastor, not even a text. I found out 2 days later, through a church bulletin my aunt forwarded me with a sticky note. "Thought you'd want to see this. Love, Aunt May." I sat on my couch holding that note like it might catch fire, wondering if it even mattered that I noticed anymore. So yeah, I've got stories, like the year they hosted the family reunion at a vineyard and somehow forgot to send me the invite. "It must have gotten lost in the shuffle," Helen had said, not even blinking, while showing off the group photo that hung in her hallway for years. I wasn't in that one either. Not cropped this time, just not invited. It was around then that I stopped asking, but it wasn't until 2 years ago that I decided to start building something just for me. I launched my digital branding agency from my tiny home office, figuring if I couldn't get my family to acknowledge me, I'd build something so big they couldn't ignore me. I named the company Fifth Frame because, you guessed it, the Murphy house always had 4 frames on the wall. Karen's wedding, Frank Jr.'s baptism, Mom and Dad's anniversary, and the grandkids' collage. No Dana. Fifth Frame took off quicker than I expected. Turns out, being the overlooked one trains you to hustle harder than anyone else. I knew how to market people who felt invisible, how to tell stories for businesses that were just getting their voice back. Within 18 months, I had 5 employees, a client list that included a few mid-sized tech firms, and more money than I'd ever made begging for my dad's approval. Still, I kept waiting for someone, anyone, to say, "We see you now." But that's not how my family worked. When Karen launched her Mommy and Me podcast, the entire family shared the link like it was a presidential campaign. When I got featured in a business magazine, not one of them mentioned it. I even sent my mom a copy. She called 2 weeks later and said, "I meant to ask, did you design that yourself?" And then came the moment I stopped waiting. It was early spring, just after Easter, and I was visiting a friend in the old neighborhood when I drove past St. Brendan's, the same church where we'd had every family baptism, wedding, and funeral since I was born. Outside, the parking lot was packed. I looked up and saw Karen posing with her kids under the church sign. Someone was snapping photos, probably for the family newsletter she insisted on sending out every December. I watched her for a long minute, engine idling, wondering if I'd be edited into this year's Christmas card like last time, awkwardly photoshopped into the back row, holding a glass of wine at a different angle, not even facing the right direction. That night, I opened Photoshop and dragged in my own headshot, the one we use on our website. I added the company logo in the corner and wrote in big white lettering, "Excluded, but never outdone." Then I picked up the phone and called a Billboard agency I knew from a past campaign. I asked how much it would cost to run an image outside a specific address for 3 weeks. He asked for the zip code. I gave it to him. When he confirmed the location, right across from St. Brendan's, I said, "Perfect. Let's do it." And as I clicked send on the final design, something inside me shifted. This wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't petty. It was a declaration. A billboard-sized, high-resolution declaration that I had always been here, whether they looked at me or not. They had no idea that this time, the one they erased was about to rewrite everything. If I ever believed that being excluded from a few family photos or the occasional gathering was just an oversight, some innocent mistake lost in the shuffle of busy lives and overpacked calendars, that illusion fully shattered the day I saw the Christmas photo, framed, printed, and proudly displayed in my mother's hallway, where my image had been poorly, almost mockingly, photoshopped in from a picture they took of me 5 years earlier at a random backyard barbecue, wearing a different outfit, holding a solo cup, and looking completely detached from everyone else who stood in perfect rows, arms around each other, glowing in the light of a professional photographer's lens. It was so obvious I hadn't been there. It was laughable, except no one was laughing. Not at the absurdity, not at the blatant erasure of my presence from the real event, because this was what they did now. They didn't invite me. And then, if I caused too much noise about it, they patched me in digitally, like I was a sticker or some kind of ghost with no voice, no presence, no weight in their lives. I stared at that image for what felt like an hour, first confused, then embarrassed, and finally so furious I could hardly think straight. Not because I cared about the photo itself. I had long stopped expecting to be included in any meaningful way, but because it proved something I had quietly suspected for years, but never dared to name. They wanted the illusion of family without the inconvenience of me. They wanted the perfectly curated version, the highlight reel, the kind of Norman Rockwell fantasy that they could pass around to their friends and church group members and say, "Look at us, we're doing just fine." And the only thing standing in the way of that illusion, in their minds, was me, the independent one, the unmarried one, the one who never quite stayed in the lines, who didn't fake smiles well, and who, more than anything else, had the gall to remember the things they wished I'd forget. By the time I was 35, the pattern had become impossible to deny. My sister Karen had 4 kids, a husband who sold insurance, and a face that lit up every time someone mentioned potluck dinners or PTA bake sales. She was the perfect daughter in my mother's eyes, presentable, agreeable, polished in the way that made family friends gush about how lucky Helen was to have raised such a successful young woman, as if being married and reproducing on schedule counted as a personal triumph. Meanwhile, I had built a business from scratch, taken care of myself for decades, and navigated a life without leaning on anyone, but none of that made it onto the family scoreboard. In fact, it often felt like the more I achieved, the less they knew how to relate to me, like I was a foreign object in their domestic ecosystem, an uncomfortable reminder that someone could thrive without following their formula. The real turning point came not during a fight or some dramatic family blow-up, but in a painfully ordinary moment. I was checking Facebook during a lunch break when I saw a photo posted by one of my cousins, Aunt Maureen's youngest daughter, always a little tone-deaf but well-meaning, who had written, "Another amazing Murphy Christmas. Even Dana made it this time. LOL." And there it was again, the same doctored photo, my face cropped in like a guest star in my own family's narrative. The comments beneath it made my stomach turn. "So good to see everyone together. Finally, a full house. Beautiful family." No one noticed, or maybe no one cared, that the lighting on my face didn't match, that I wasn't looking in the same direction as everyone else, or that my hand, in the version they used, was holding a plastic fork instead of the matching champagne glasses held by the others. That was the moment it clicked. Not just the sadness or anger, but the sense of total clarity. They didn't want me there. They just wanted to pretend I was for the sake of appearance, for the stories they told their neighbors, for the clean, presentable image of the family that had it all together. And if I had to be dragged in by digital force, so be it. But asking me to physically show up, to exist in their space, take up room, be a real breathing part of the scene, that was too much for them. I was inconvenient. I was non-conforming. I was their ghost in every sense but the literal, so I stopped waiting. I stopped sending birthday texts to nieces and nephews who didn't recognize me in public. I stopped making excuses for why I wasn't there, because the truth was, I hadn't been invited, and no one cared enough to ask why. I leaned into my business, threw myself into work like it was oxygen, and made damn sure that if I was going to be excluded, I would at least have something to show for it, something they couldn't crop out or ignore or rewrite with a filter. But despite all the armor I'd built around myself, some part of me still wanted, maybe even needed, one last confrontation. One last undeniable statement that I had existed all along, that I had been watching, documenting, remembering. So when I started drafting the billboard, just a joke at first, a little fantasy scribbled on a cocktail napkin, I didn't think I'd actually go through with it. But something about that image, my awkward smile glued into a celebration I was never part of, made the joke feel less like revenge and more like justice. I opened my laptop, pulled my favorite headshot from the company archives, and started designing. My face, clear and direct, looking out at whoever had the misfortune of driving past it. My company logo in the corner, clean and modern, the thing I'd poured my soul into, and underneath it, bold white lettering that said everything I never got the chance to say in person. Excluded, but never outdone. I knew exactly where it would go, right across from St. Brendan's, the church where they all gathered, the sacred temple of Helen's curated life. When I called the sign company, the guy on the phone sounded curious. "You sure about this location?" he asked, double-checking the address. "It's across from a church." I smiled, not that he could see it, and said, "That's the point." I paid the deposit right there, 5 figures without blinking, and scheduled the install for a Saturday morning, just in time for their monthly church brunch. And as I closed my laptop and stared at the blank wall in my office, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not pain, but control. Because this wasn't about a billboard, not really. It was about finally telling my story in a way that no one could edit, mute, or replace. And whether they laughed, cried, or drove past in stunned silence, one thing was certain: they were going to see me now. By the time I reached my 40s, the idea of family had become less of a warm memory and more of a cold habit, something I acknowledged out of obligation, not affection, like the smell of mothballs in an old coat closet, or the mechanical "thank you" you murmur when someone holds the door. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was a long, slow erasure, the kind that sneaks up on you like fog over the water. One moment you think you can still see the shore, and the next you realize you're completely surrounded by gray, and no one's looking for you anymore. People always assume that when someone is pushed out of a family, there must have been a catalyst. Some huge betrayal, a screaming match, a betrayal that shattered the foundation. But for me, it wasn't like that at all. It was thousands of small slights, subtle omissions, little digs said under the breath or with a tight-lipped smile, moments that wouldn't make headlines but accumulated like sediment until the weight of them became something you couldn't carry anymore. And maybe that's why I stayed in therapy for as long as I did. Not because I was looking for answers, I already knew what the answers were, but because I needed someone, anyone, to believe me when I said, "They act like I don't exist, and it's not in my head." Dr. Levin, a sharp but kind woman with a penchant for wearing heavy knit cardigans even in July, once told me during a session that my family dynamic resembled what psychologists call scapegoating, a pattern where one person absorbs all the dysfunction of the group so the rest can pretend they're fine. At first, I laughed because it sounded too clinical, too dramatic, too much like a plot in a bad TV movie. But the more I sat with it, the more it made sense. I was the one they rolled their eyes at, the one who always made things complicated, the one who overreacted, the one who was never happy. But what they never admitted was that I was also the one who remembered. Every time my mother canceled lunch without notice, every time Karen called me just jealous, every time my father stared past me like he was waiting for a version of me that would never arrive. It wasn't like I hadn't tried to reach across the void. I had shown up time and again for birthdays, for holidays, for events I wasn't even invited to, but crashed out of sheer desperation to belong. I had brought gifts, offered help, played nice, bit my tongue until it practically bled. And for what? To be told that I was too much, that I shouldn't bring up the past, that I needed to move on from things that were never even acknowledged, let alone apologized for. Eventually, the trying started to feel more humiliating than the exclusion itself, like I was begging for scraps at a table that never had a seat for me in the first place. The most disturbing moment came one random Tuesday afternoon when my mother, in a rare moment of unfiltered candor, told me something I wish I could unhear. We were sitting in her kitchen, and I was helping her fill out a medical form because she'd twisted her wrist gardening. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the clock ticking and the wind pressing against the window. And then she said, with a strange kind of distant nostalgia in her voice, "You know you were an accident, but back then I thought maybe it was a lucky one." She didn't look up from the form. She just kept writing as if she hadn't dropped a grenade into my chest. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just sat there, stunned, feeling a strange mix of clarity and nausea, because it was the first time she had ever admitted that I wasn't part of the plan, that I was a glitch in her narrative. And in that moment, I realized that nothing I did, no achievement, no act of loyalty, no gesture of love, was ever going to rewrite that first impression of me as an interruption. After that, I stopped attending the mandatory family rituals. No more Christmas Eve dinners where I brought the wine no one drank. No more baby showers for Karen's ever-expanding brood. No more last-minute guilt invites that came with asterisks and passive-aggressive undertones. Instead, I poured myself into fifth frame, working longer hours, taking bigger risks, signing clients from coast to coast. I built a team that respected me, clients who listened to my ideas, a business that bore my fingerprints on every surface. And still, when I finally made the Forbes Local Innovators list, my face in print, my story told without edits, I sent a copy to my family group chat, and the only response I got was from Karen, a thumbs-up reaction, not even a message, just a pixelated, lazy approval from the sister who once said, "You always act like you're better than us." But I wasn't trying to be better, I was trying to be seen. And when I couldn't get that from them, I started looking elsewhere. Which is why, when my website's contact form lit up with an anonymous submission just days before the Billboard was set to go live, I almost dismissed it as spam. But something about the wording made me pause. It read, "I always knew what they were doing to you. I didn't know how to stop it, but I saw it, Dad." I must have read it 10 times, my heart pounding, unsure if it was real, if he actually wrote it, or if it was just a cruel joke. Because my father, stoic, silent, emotionally opaque Frank Murphy Sr., had never said anything even remotely that vulnerable in his entire life. He was the man who watched me walk across the stage at graduation and didn't clap. The man who once told a neighbor that I did all right for herself. When I got my second office space, as if I was a coworker he barely tolerated. But this message, cryptic and unsigned except for that last word, suggested something I had never allowed myself to believe. That he wasn't unaware, just unwilling. That he had seen the way they treated me, the way my mother wielded control like a weapon, the way Karen played the martyr while quietly feeding the narrative that I was impossible. It wasn't an apology, and it certainly wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it shifted something. If even one person in that family knew, truly knew, what they had done, then maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe I wasn't the villain. Maybe I had just been the only one who refused to lie about the truth. And so, with the billboard scheduled, the artwork finalized, and the check cleared, I made one final decision. I would confront my father, face to face, not with rage or tears, but with the quiet, steady defiance of someone who has finally realized her worth is not up for debate. Because maybe I was a ghost in their eyes, but I was done haunting the edges of their life. Now I was going to stand in the light, unedited, uninvited, but undeniable. When the morning of the installation arrived, I sat in my car a few blocks away from St. Brendan's, feeling the slow tension coil in my chest as the sun climbed higher and the smell of fresh-cut grass and coffee from the church cafe drifted toward me. And while most people might have laughed that I was nervous about erecting a giant photo of myself in public, the truth was that I had spent nearly half my life waiting for someone in my family to finally see me without trying to hide what they didn't want. And this moment where my face would be visible to everyone attending the Sunday brunch, felt far more powerful than any prayer or potluck sacrifice I could have made in all the years of being overlooked, ignored, or forgotten. The Billboard company had delivered the canvas late the previous night, carefully rolled and stored in a warehouse loft, and the installers had told me the metal frame would go up at dawn, with the graphic mounted and taped inside the hour before the first mass began. Meaning that at the precise moment when parishioners walked toward the front doors, they would be greeted not with a scripture or a hymn, but with the sight of my face, my logo, and the words, "Excluded but never outdone," as if that mocking declaration was part of their religious experience. And maybe in some strange way it would become that. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I ran my fingers along the dashboard, glancing around at the familiar neighborhood that had witnessed every Murphy milestone except one, the one in which I mattered. I had rehearsed my post not just in my head, but in countless text drafts, in journal entries, in late-night phone calls, with the one friend who had always understood the stakes of this moment, the one who told me I was both brave and petty, and that maybe those two things were not opposites, but partners when you refused to be silent. And though I knew people would call me vindictive or narcissistic, I also knew that nearly every person who ever lived in that town would have better than average idea of who the Murphys were, Helen's perfected front porch, the PTA bake sale branding, the pastor's daughter, the Golden family, while most of them would have absolutely no reason to know anything about Fifth Frame, my business. And yet this moment, this perfectly timed display of defiance, would not just force them to look at me, but to at least question why I was there, whether I belonged, and whether the polished veneer of respectability they bought into might conceal something darker. As a project manager, I knew the power of narrative, and as a daughter who had spent her life crouched in the cold shade of invisibility, I was offering the world a brief but unignorable glimpse of what happened when you push someone out too many times, too often. Once the installers sent the text message confirming the job was complete, I stepped out of my car and walked toward the billboard like I was approaching a confession booth. But instead of asking for forgiveness, I was asking the world to bear witness. People were already gathering, mothers pushing strollers, older couples linking arms, teenagers chatting in groups. The whole town's Sunday exodus compacted into one little intersection where my image now stared across the tarmac. Some glanced at me like they recognized me, maybe from the local business magazine or from my occasional keynotes at entrepreneurial events. But most walked by without stopping, their expressions registering curiosity or uncertainty, as if they couldn't decide whether they were supposed to feel inspired, offended, or obligated to change lanes. When I saw it, the full design aligned perfectly in the frame, the print quality crisp enough that you could almost read the fine text on the logo. I felt a sting of satisfaction mixed with dread, like I'd finally delivered my lines, but the encore would be what really mattered. And then the first churchgoers arrived, stepping out of buses and cars, hugging, greeting each other, pausing as the image of me caught their eye, as if an unexpected guest had shown up at the front door of their Sunday ritual. And I watched the ripple effect begin. A small group of elderly women tilting their heads, whispering as they pointed. A young couple apparently on a date, slowing down long enough to exchange furtive glances. A few teenagers taking selfies in front of the billboard as if it was a tourist attraction. And one of the church deacons, the one who had once asked me who I was when I delivered sandwiches during the post-funeral cleanup, standing at the edge of the lot and staring like he couldn't quite reconcile my face with his memory of the shy volunteer who had slipped away without making a fuss. I felt my breath catch, because this was what I'd wanted. Not just attention, but recognition. Not just presence, but disruption. I wanted them to know that I was there, that I had always been there, and that for once I would not be just another blur in the corner of the frame. The local paper ran a story that evening under the headline, "Mysterious Billboard Faces Church Sparks Community Buzz," describing how the message had divided the congregation and how town gossip had begun to swirl about who that woman was, and why her face was staring at them that morning. And I sat at home scrolling through online comments, some calling me brave, others calling me selfish, but most of all observing the echo chamber I'd created. The whirlpool of narratives that were no longer about me, as the sister who never showed up, but as the woman who forced the world to show up for her. Meanwhile, emails started coming in. Not just from loyal clients praising the visibility and the genius marketing angle, even if unorthodox, but from distant relatives I'd never known existed, offering words like sorry, proud, wish I'd known, let's talk. And there were other messages too, what I chose to call the darker kind, emails from people who thought I'd gone too far, who lectured me on the sanctity of church, the harm I'd caused, the embarrassment I'd brought upon our family name. One of them, sent from what looked like my cousin's account, said simply, "Mother's in the hospital. Because of you." No one could confirm if it was true, or if it was just guilt used as a weapon, but it landed hard in me, the same way that my mother's voicemail did when it finally came through later that night. "I hope you're happy now," she said, voice brittle, flat, like glass. "I hope you got what you wanted." She hung up before I could respond, but I hadn't called her or anyone. I'd called the world, and the world had answered in its strange, messy, beautiful, harrowing way. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for the first time in decades, I felt both exposed and seen, and while fear raced through me because I had no idea what came next, what kind of fallout awaited me, what he might actually say or do, or what would collapse under the weight of this moment, whether our family could survive it or it might shatter us all, I also felt something far rarer, the tight, burning bloom of power that comes from being the one who tells her own story first, in her own way, on her own terms, and I knew that no matter how this ended, the world had already pivoted toward me, and for once nothing would be the same. When I finally stood in front of my father's house, our house really, the one I'd left behind so many years ago, without ceremony, without tears, and certainly without a goodbye that meant anything, I felt the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing against my ribs, like the tightness before a storm. The kind of storm that doesn't scream but lingers in the air with quiet menace. And as I looked up at the pale blue siding that had faded from weather and time, the overgrown shrubs that Helen used to trim religiously now creeping up the edges of the porch, I realized this wasn't just a homecoming, but a reckoning, a slow-motion confrontation with every version of myself I had buried beneath years of silence and compromise. I knocked once, then again, and when the door opened to reveal my father, grayer, thinner, but still standing with that stubborn rigidity that made him seem carved from stone, I didn't say anything, not at first, because the air between us was already thick with the question neither of us had ever asked directly. How do you begin to speak when an entire lifetime has existed in the spaces between what was said and what was never acknowledged? He stepped aside, wordlessly, and I walked past him into the foyer, where the air still carried that unmistakable scent of lemon cleaner and old wood, the same combination I'd smelled as a child, when I sat on the stairs and listened to my parents argue about things they never told us about later. Bills, discipline, disappointment, and I noticed immediately what had changed. The walls, once cluttered with family portraits, now looked sparse, almost curated, like someone had begun removing evidence but hadn't finished the job. The biggest change, however, was at the far end of the hall, where the 4 infamous frames used to hang in perfect symmetry, each devoted to one of their chosen legacies. And now there were only 3. I stopped walking. My father didn't speak. He stood a few feet behind me, as if he knew exactly what I was seeing, but didn't know how, or maybe didn't have the courage, to explain it. "Where's the 4th frame?" I asked, not turning around yet, my eyes still fixed on the blank space where Karen's wedding photo had once hung in all its satin-laced perfection. He took a slow breath, the kind that carries decades inside it, and said, "She took it down herself. Said it didn't feel right anymore." And that was all. No condemnation, no explanation, just that. As if removing a photo could rebalance the family, as if empty space could repair the damage that had been done by filling it for so many years with only the people they had deemed acceptable. We moved to the kitchen, the place where I'd once burned my hand on a curling iron plugged in too close to the sink, and where my mother had once told me, while baking sugar cookies, that girls who asked too many questions were unlikely to get married. I sat down at the table where she used to place 3 plates, never 4, when it came to important guests. And across from me, my father sat slowly, awkwardly, as if the chair itself might recoil from what we were about to say. He looked at me, not with warmth or apology, but with a kind of resignation that suggested he'd known, somewhere deep down, that this moment would eventually arrive. "I wrote the message," he said, his voice lower than I remembered, more gravel than iron. "I didn't know how else to tell you that I saw it, that I saw you. I could have demanded more words, more details, more admission of guilt. But there was something about the way he said it, stripped of defense, that made me believe him. And I realized, maybe for the first time, that silence hadn't always meant indifference. Sometimes silence is survival. Sometimes people don't fight for you because they're too scared of what the fight might reveal. He told me things I didn't expect. That my mother had been the architect of more than I knew. That she'd decided which photos to hang. That she'd referred to me more than once as the complicated one. That he'd argued, softly, not enough, but had been told that keeping peace meant not stirring the water. He admitted that he'd read the local paper the day the billboard went up and hadn't told her until she saw it herself. She hadn't fainted like I'd imagined. But she'd locked herself in the bedroom for 2 days and told the family to leave her alone, said she needed to grieve what Dana had become. And when he said that, I almost laughed. Not out of humor, but out of that bitter absurdity that comes from being so thoroughly misunderstood, you become a stranger to people who once held you in their arms. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there and let it land in my chest like a brick, heavy but not shattering, because at this point, there was nothing they could say that would unmake what I had become. And when I stood up to leave, I didn't expect anything, no apology, no reconciliation, but as I turned toward the door, I caught a glimpse of something that made me stop cold. On the hallway wall, near the staircase, was a new frame, smaller, solitary, and inside it a photo I hadn't seen before, me standing on stage at a speaking event, microphone in hand, mid-sentence, eyes bright, not cropped, not edited, just me. I looked at him, and he said nothing. He didn't need to. I walked closer, studied the frame, and saw that beneath it was a brass plate that simply read Dana. No dates, no titles, no qualifiers, just my name. And somehow, that said more than anything they'd ever given me. As I stepped back outside, the sun sharp in the early afternoon sky, I realized that frame wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an invitation. It was a concession, a quiet, subtle nod to the fact that I had existed, not just in their periphery, but in a way they could no longer deny. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was love in a language too fractured to be spoken aloud. And as I walked down the porch steps and back toward my car, I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt calm because for the first time, I wasn't chasing a seat at their table. I had built my own. It was big, it was loud, it had my face printed 20 feet high, and no one could take that away from me.